Commander Jake Morrison stood at the bridge window of the UNS Retribution and watched the stars move past like tiny diamonds scattered across black cloth. 3 years had passed since the Zathran Empire arrived at Earth with their massive warships and their demands for immediate surrender. 3 years since they destroyed the colonies on Mars and Europa without warning. 3 years since humanity learned that the galaxy was not a friendly place and that begging for mercy only made the predators hungrier. The war had been brutal and the losses were terrible, but somehow, humanity had survived and now they were winning. The Zathran were reptilian creatures who stood nearly 8 feet tall, with scales that shimmered green and gold under artificial light. They had ruled a dozen star systems for over 1,000 years, and they viewed humans as weak primitives who should be grateful to serve as slaves. But the Zathran made one critical mistake. They underestimated what desperate humans could do when their backs were against the wall. Earth scientists worked day and night to reverse engineer captured alien technology. Military leaders threw out every outdated rule and created new tactics that made no sense to species who had fought the same way for centuries. Soldiers trained until they could fight in their sleep, and when they went into battle they fought like cornered wolves. Jake had been a civilian, cargo pilot before the war, but those peaceful days felt like someone else's memories now. He joined the military on the day the Zathran destroyed his home station and killed his parents along with 20,000 other people. The training was hard and fast because Earth needed every pilot it could get. He flew his first combat mission 3 months after enlisting, and he was terrified the entire time, but he came back alive, while 2 of his squadron mates did not. That was how war worked. You survived or you died, and luck played a bigger role than anyone wanted to admit. Lieutenant Amy Chen interrupted his thoughts when she called out from the communications station. She was young and brilliant and had a gift for reading between the lines of encrypted messages. The commander trusted her judgment completely. Amy looked worried, and that made Jake pay attention immediately, because she rarely showed concern about anything. She told him they were receiving a priority transmission from Galactic Council space, and the sender was demanding they accept it right away. Jake felt his jaw tighten because he knew exactly who was calling, and he knew he was not going to like what they had to say. The Galactic Council was supposed to be the great mediator of disputes between the hundreds of species that lived among the stars. They had existed for thousands of years, and they prided themselves on maintaining peace and order throughout known space. But when the Zathran invaded human territory, the Council did absolutely nothing. Jake remembered the messages that Earth sent begging for help and explaining that millions of civilians were dying. He remembered the polite responses that talked about territorial disputes and the need for both sides to negotiate in good faith. He remembered the final message that said the Council could not intervene because it would set a dangerous precedent. That was when humanity realized they were completely alone. Jake told Amy to put the transmission through, and the main view screen flickered to life. High Arbiter Velnoth appeared, and the alien looked exactly as Jake remembered from the news broadcasts. Velnoth belonged to a species that resembled tall, thin ghosts with pale blue skin and enormous black eyes. They claimed to have evolved beyond violence centuries ago, and they spoke in calm, measured tones that made everything sound reasonable, even when it was completely insane. The High Arbiter wasted no time with pleasantries and announced that the Galactic Council was ordering an immediate ceasefire between humanity and the Zathran Empire. Both sides were to stop all fighting within 12 hours, and any violation would result in severe penalties. Jake stared at the alien face on the screen and felt anger rising in his chest like hot metal. The Zathran had attacked without provocation and killed billions of humans and enslaved millions more. They burned colonies and destroyed cities and laughed while they did it. And now that humanity was finally pushing them back and winning battle after battle, the Council suddenly decided it was time for peace. It was so obvious what was happening. The Council did not care about justice or fairness. They cared about maintaining the status quo, and humanity winning against a powerful empire threatened that balance. Jake asked why they should stop when the enemy had shown no mercy and committed countless atrocities. Velnoth replied with that same calm voice and explained that further violence served no purpose now that the Zathran had agreed to reparations and territorial concessions. The war had gone on long enough, and it was time for cooler heads to prevail. Jake felt his hands curl into fists, and he had to force himself to speak slowly and clearly. He asked where the Council was when the Zathran glassed New Sydney and turned a thriving city of 5 million people into radioactive ash. He asked where they were when Zathran raiders harvested colonists on Kepler Station and sold them as slaves to species that humans did not even have names for yet. He said humanity begged for intervention, and the Council declared it an internal matter. That did not concern them. The High Arbiter's face remained neutral and impassive, as if Jake was discussing the weather rather than the deaths of billions. Vilnoth stated that the Council's decision was final, and humanity would comply or face sanctions that would isolate Earth from the galactic community forever. The threat was clear, and it might have worked on a species that valued acceptance and wanted to be part of the club. But humanity had already been isolated and abandoned when they needed help most. They learned to stand alone, and they learned that the galaxy respected strength, not righteousness. Jake looked at the alien diplomat and said with absolute certainty that the answer was no. Vilnoth seemed genuinely surprised and repeated that refusing a council order would have serious consequences. Jake cut the transmission before the alien could finish speaking and turned to face his crew. Every officer on the bridge was watching him and waiting to see what he would do next. These men and women had followed him through dozens of battles, and they trusted his judgment, even when the odds looked impossible. Jake told the helm officer to set a course for the Zathran homeworld at maximum speed. The crew moved immediately to carry out his orders without hesitation or doubt. Amy approached him quietly and asked if he was sure about this decision. Defying the council meant burning bridges that could never be rebuilt. It meant becoming outcasts in a galaxy where being alone was often fatal. Jake understood all of that, but he also understood something more important. Humanity had spent 3 years learning to survive against impossible odds. They had built weapons and ships and tactics that made ancient empires tremble. They had proven that humans could adapt and evolve faster than any species the galaxy had ever seen, and they were just getting started. The Retribution accelerated toward Zathran space, and behind it came 50 more human warships loaded with soldiers and weapons and a determination that would not bend or break. Word spread quickly through the fleet about what Jake had done, and the response was unanimous. Not a single captain questioned the order. They had all lost friends and family to the Zathran, and they all remembered being abandoned by the Council. If the galaxy wanted humanity to stop fighting, then the galaxy should have helped when the fighting started. But they did not help, and now they would learn what happened when you left humans with no choice but to win or die. Council Station Alpha floated in neutral space between 3 major galactic trade routes, and it was designed to be a symbol of peace and cooperation. The massive structure was built from materials donated by 200 different species, and it contained chambers where delegates could meet without fear or prejudice. For thousands of years, the Council had resolved disputes and prevented wars and maintained an order that most species accepted without question. But on this particular day, the crystal halls echoed with shouting voices and angry accusations, because for the first time in recorded history, someone had openly defied a direct council order, and nobody knew how to respond. Ambassador Kyle Harris stood in the center of the circular assembly chamber and felt the weight of hundreds of alien eyes watching his every movement. He was alone because Earth had only one representative on the council, and that single voice counted for almost nothing among the ancient powers that dominated galactic politics. Kyle was a career diplomat who had spent 20 years learning alien languages and customs and negotiating trade agreements that benefited both sides. He believed in the power of words and compromise until the day the Zathran invaded and the Council turned its back on humanity. That was when he learned that diplomacy only worked when both sides wanted peace, and the galaxy was full of species who preferred conquest. Counselor Thexara was the first to speak, and her 3 eyes blazed with indignation as she accused humanity of barbaric behavior. She said human fleets were continuing their advance despite clear orders to stop, and she demanded to know if humans understood what diplomacy meant. Her species had been part of the Council for over 5,000 years, and they viewed themselves as the guardians of civilization. Kyle listened to her words and felt a cold fury building inside him, because he knew exactly where this conversation was going. They would lecture him about rules and order and proper behavior, while completely ignoring the fact that they had allowed millions of humans to die. Kyle smiled without any warmth reaching his eyes and said that humans understood diplomacy perfectly well. He explained that 3 years ago, when the Zathran invaded Earth, sent diplomatic requests to every single council member, begging for help, or at least mediation. 27 messages went unanswered, and when someone finally responded, the answer was worse than silence. He asked if Thexara remembered what the Council told humanity when they finally got through. The chamber fell silent, and Kyle knew they all remembered, but nobody wanted to admit it out loud. He continued speaking, and his voice was calm but hard as steel. The council said the Zathran had valid territorial claims, and humanity should negotiate in good faith. They said intervention would set a dangerous precedent and upset the delicate balance of power. They said a lot of things that sounded reasonable if you ignored the fact that cities were burning and people were dying by the millions. Kyle told them that humanity learned a valuable lesson from that experience. The council protected species that were already powerful and well-connected. The council did not protect species that were weak or newly arrived. The council maintained order, but order was not the same thing as justice, and sometimes order just meant letting the strong devour the weak without interference. "Hi, Arbiter." Belnoth tried to restore some dignity to the proceedings and stated firmly that such behavior was unacceptable. The Zathran had sued for peace and offered compensation, and there was no reason to continue the violence. Kyle laughed, and the sound was bitter and harsh in the formal chamber. He said the Zathran offered compensation because they were losing, not because they felt sorry or learned anything about mercy. They offered peace because human warships were destroying their fleets and occupying their worlds, and they were terrified. Kyle said frankly that they should be terrified because humanity was teaching them what happened when you attacked people who had nothing left to lose. Admiral Lisa Campbell commanded the 2nd Fleet near Council Space, and she had orders to observe but not engage unless directly threatened. Her ships maintained a defensive perimeter, while Council vessels moved nervously nearby, trying to decide if humanity was bluffing about their willingness to fight everyone. Lisa sent a coded transmission to Kyle, asking what she should do if Council forces tried to interfere with human operations. Kyle responded immediately and told her to hold position without retreating a single meter. Let them watch and let them wonder if they really wanted to test whether humans would fight a two-front war. Lisa smiled when she received the message because she knew her crews were ready for anything. Back in the assembly chamber, Councillor Dreth spoke with careful, measured words. His species had been founding members of the council, and they prided themselves on wisdom and patience. He appealed to Kyle's sense of reason and suggested that surely humans could see the bigger picture. The galaxy operated on certain principles that had maintained stability for millennia: order and predictability and measured responses to crises. If every species acted on emotion rather than logic, then chaos would consume everything. Kyle listened respectfully because Dreth at least spoke without condescension, but the argument was still hollow. Kyle said quietly that those principles left 15 billion humans dead and millions more enslaved or displaced. The Council's stability was built on the suffering of species that nobody important cared about. So humanity had developed a measured response of their own. They were going to finish what the Zathran started and make absolutely certain that the Reptilian Empire could never threaten anyone again. Then they were going to rebuild Zathran society from the ground up and teach them how to coexist peacefully, even if it took 50 years of occupation. If the Council did not like that approach, then they were welcome to try stopping human forces. The threat hung in the air like smoke, and every delegate understood what Kyle was really saying. Humanity had evolved beyond recognition during 3 years of total war. Human ships used weapons and tactics that made no sense to species that fought by tradition and honor codes. Human soldiers were trained to win at any cost, and they adapted faster than any military force in known galactic history. Council peacekeeping fleets were designed to police minor disputes between trading partners. They were not prepared to fight a species that treated survival as the only rule that mattered. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Belnoth made one final attempt to salvage the situation and warned Kyle that if humanity continued this path, they risked permanent expulsion from galactic society. No trade agreements and no diplomatic relations and no access to council-protected space. Earth would be completely isolated, and that isolation would destroy human civilization within a generation. The threat would have been devastating to most species, because being cut off from the galactic community meant technological stagnation and economic collapse. But Kyle had already considered that possibility, and he knew something the Council did not understand. Humans were very good at surviving in isolation. Kyle gathered his papers and prepared to leave the chamber. He said calmly that expulsion from a club that watched humanity burn was not exactly a terrible punishment. Humans would survive just fine without Council approval, because they had already learned to stand alone. He wished them all a good day and walked out while delegates erupted into arguing about what should be done. Some wanted to send military forces to support the Zathran. Others wanted to do nothing and hope the problem resolved itself. A few younger delegates quietly suggested that maybe the humans had a point, and maybe the council needed to examine its own policies. But those voices were shouted down by the elder members who refused to admit that anything was wrong with the system. Kyle returned to his small office and sent a report back to Earth describing what happened. He knew the government would support his position, because the alternative was surrendering to people who had already proven they could not be trusted. Humanity had no allies in this fight, but they had something better. They had a unified purpose and a burning determination to prove that being weak did not mean accepting whatever the strong decided to inflict. The galaxy was about to learn a very hard lesson about what happened when you pushed humans too far, and then told them to stop fighting back. The planet Krathis hung before them like a green and brown jewel wrapped in thin clouds, and Captain Nick Rodriguez felt his stomach tighten as he studied the tactical display. This was the Zathran homeworld, and it was protected by 3 orbital defense platforms and the largest concentration of enemy warships that humanity had faced since the war began. The display showed over 300 capital ships arranged in defensive formations that had protected this system for 1,000 years. 3 years ago, that fleet would have been completely impossible to defeat, but the humans who stared at those red dots on their screens were not the same people who had fled in terror when the war started. Nick commanded the carrier UNS Vengeance, and she was one of the new generation warships built specifically to fight aliens who thought they were unbeatable. The Vengeance carried 200 fighters and enough firepower to crack a moon if necessary. Her crew had trained for 9 months in simulations that pushed them past every breaking point, until fighting became as natural as breathing. Nick trusted every single person on his ship, because they had proven themselves in a dozen battles where one mistake meant death. Lieutenant Sam Parker called out from the tactical station that multiple contacts were breaking orbit and moving to intercept. The Zathran home fleet was coming to meet them. Nick studied the enemy formation carefully and saw exactly what he expected to see. The Zathran were arranging themselves in the traditional battle wall that had won them countless victories over weaker opponents. Massive battleships formed the center, while cruisers and destroyers protected the flanks and carriers launched fighters to screen the advance. It was textbook strategy that would have worked perfectly against any conventional enemy. But humans stopped fighting conventionally about 2 years ago, when they realized that following the rules meant losing. Nick ordered all fighters to launch immediately and told the battle group to execute Hammer Pattern 7. His crew responded without hesitation, because they had drilled this maneuver until they could do it blind. The battle began with a fury that caught the Zathran completely off guard. Human fighters did not engage in the traditional dogfights that every species expected. Instead, they swarmed like angry insects around the larger ships and used coordinated strikes to overwhelm point defense systems. Destroyers accelerated to speeds that should have torn them apart, and used gravity wells created by their experimental drives as weapons that crushed enemy ships like tin cans. Carriers deployed thousands of automated drones that learned and adapted their tactics in real time based on enemy responses. The Zathran had never seen anything like it, and their formations began to break apart as panic spread through their command structure. Nick watched the tactical display update every second as red dots winked out and friendly forces pressed their advantage. The plan was working better than he had dared to hope. Human ships danced through the battle space in patterns that looked random, but were actually carefully calculated to exploit every weakness in traditional defensive doctrine. Zathran captains tried to adapt, but they were fighting according to tactics that had not changed in centuries, while humans invented new approaches every single battle. 4 hours after the engagement began, the mighty Zathran home fleet was shattered. Debris floated where proud warships had been, and the few surviving enemy vessels were retreating toward the planet in complete disarray. General Victoria Price commanded the ground forces that would occupy Krathis after orbital superiority was established. She watched the battle from her command ship and felt a grim satisfaction when the enemy fleet broke. Victoria had been a military historian before the war, and she understood better than most how remarkable it was that humanity had come this far. She also understood that winning battles was only the first step. The hard part was going to be everything that came after. Her ships moved into position above the planet, and she began receiving surrender offers from a dozen different Zathran military commanders. Each one claimed to speak for their government, and each one contradicted what the others were saying. The Empire was falling apart in real time. Major Danny Wright approached Victoria with reports from other task forces operating throughout Zathran space. Every single star system was reporting the same thing. The enemy was surrendering across the board. Isolated resistance continued in some places, but organized military opposition had effectively collapsed. The war that had consumed 3 years and cost billions of lives was over. Danny expected Victoria to smile or show some relief, but instead she looked more serious than ever. She told him the war was not over at all, because they were just getting to the important part. Winning was easy compared to what came next. Victoria opened a channel to all human forces in the system, and her voice was clear and firm. She announced that Phase 1 was complete, and they were moving immediately into Phase 2, which was occupation and reconstruction. She reminded everyone of their training and emphasized that they were not conquerors who came to loot and destroy. They were teachers who would show the Zathran people what it meant to coexist peacefully, even if that lesson took 50 years to sink in. The soldiers who heard that message understood what she meant. This was not going to be a quick victory celebration followed by going home. This was going to be a long, difficult commitment that required patience and discipline. Back at Council Station Alpha, the delegates watched their screens in disbelief as human forces began landing on Krathis. They expected to see cities burned and populations slaughtered because that was how wars of conquest usually ended. Instead, they saw human ships distributing food and medical supplies to civilians who had been cut off from aid during the fighting. They saw engineers working to restore power plants and water treatment facilities. They saw field hospitals being established to treat wounded Zathran soldiers and civilians without discrimination. The council members looked at each other in confusion, because this was not how victorious armies were supposed to behave. Ambassador Kyle addressed the council again while still images from Krathis played on screens throughout the chamber. He could see the confusion on their faces, and he understood it completely, because what humanity was doing made no sense according to traditional galactic politics. Kyle explained patiently that humans were not interested in revenge, even though they had every right to want it. They were interested in making absolutely certain this never happened again to anyone. The Zathran Empire would be systematically dismantled. Their military would be reduced to a small defensive force. Their government would be restructured under human oversight, with checks and balances to prevent future aggression. The process would take decades, and humanity was completely committed to seeing it through. Councillor Thexera protested loudly that this was nothing more than colonialism, dressed up in nice words. Kyle shook his head and corrected her firmly. Colonialism was what the Zathran practiced when they invaded weaker species and stripped their worlds bare. This was accountability, which was something the Council seemed allergic to. The Zathran would not be exploited or enslaved. They would be educated and guided toward building a society that could function peacefully. If that looked like colonialism, then perhaps the Council needed to examine why holding people accountable for atrocities seemed so similar to exploitation. Commander, Jake Morrison sent a private message to Kyle from the Retribution where his ship was helping coordinate the occupation. He said the Council was going to hate humanity forever after this. Kyle read the message and smiled before replying that maybe that was a good thing. Maybe the next time a species got invaded, the Council would remember what happened when they ignored it. Maybe they would remember that strong words and diplomatic protests meant nothing without action to back them up. Maybe they would learn that maintaining order was worthless if that order protected predators and sacrificed innocents. Or maybe they would learn nothing and continue making the same mistakes. Either way, humanity had done what needed to be done. Down on the surface of Krathis, Victoria walked through the ruins of what had been a major military command center. Zathran civilians watched her pass, and their expressions were hard to read because their faces were so alien. Some looked terrified and others looked angry and a few looked almost hopeful. Victoria stopped to speak with a group of civilians through a translator. She told them that the fighting was over and nobody else needed to die. She promised that humans would help rebuild what was destroyed, and that their children would grow up in a better world. She did not know if they believed her, but she meant every word. Humanity had learned the hard way that winning was not enough. You had to do something with that victory or nothing changed. 6 months had passed since the fall of Krathis, and Colonel Rachel Bennett was learning that occupation was harder than war in ways she had never imagined. Every morning brought new problems that had no clear solutions. Insurgents who refused to accept defeat planted bombs in marketplaces where human soldiers distributed food. Civilians traumatized by years of propaganda believed humans were demons who ate children and destroyed entire planets for sport. Young Zathran, who had grown up learning that conquest was glorious, struggled to understand why strength should ever show restraint. Rachel dealt with all of it while trying to remember that these people were not her enemies anymore, even when they acted like they were. She sat in a small office that had once belonged to a Zathran general, and across from her sat former Admiral Kresh, who was the highest-ranking military officer willing to cooperate with human authorities. Kresh was old by Zathran standards, and his scales had faded from bright green to a dull gray. He had commanded fleets that conquered a dozen worlds, and now he worked with the people who destroyed everything he built. Rachel respected him because he could have chosen to fight to the death like so many others, but instead he chose to help rebuild. That took a different kind of courage. Kresh spoke bluntly and told Rachel that her people were starving because the human blockade prevented food shipments from reaching the cities. His voice carried barely controlled anger, and Rachel understood his frustration completely. She explained calmly that the military had hidden weapons inside food containers 3 separate times already. Human inspectors now examined every single shipment, which meant distribution was slower, but it also meant nobody would die from hidden explosives. Kresh's scales rippled in a gesture that meant frustration, and he demanded to know how long this would continue. Rachel said it would continue until trust was established, and that might take years. Kresh leaned back and studied Rachel with eyes that had seen more battles than she could imagine. He said humans were walking contradictions that made no sense to anyone. They destroyed the Zathran fleet with ruthless efficiency, and then healed wounded enemy soldiers. They dismantled the government and then asked the same people they defeated to build a new one. They preached about justice and mercy while maintaining military occupation. What did humans actually want from the Zathran people? Rachel thought about the question carefully before answering, because she knew her words would be repeated across the planet. She told Kresh that humans wanted the Zathran to become the species they could have been if they had chosen cooperation instead of conquest. It was possible to be strong without being cruel. It was possible to have pride without needing to dominate others. Humans had seen this pattern in their own history, where empires fell and nations rebuilt themselves into something better than before. Germany and Japan had been aggressive militaristic powers that were utterly defeated and then reconstructed into peaceful democracies. It took time and patience and massive investment, but it worked. The same transformation could happen here if the Zathran were willing to try. At Council Station Alpha, the political landscape was shifting in ways that nobody had anticipated. Smaller species that had remained silent for centuries began challenging council decisions openly. They cited humanity's example and asked why they should accept protection that came with no real benefits. Ambassador Kyle found himself leading an unofficial coalition of protected species who were tired of being protected right into irrelevance. The meetings happened in private rooms away from the Grand Assembly Chamber, where elder species tried to maintain their grip on power. Change was coming whether the old guard liked it or not. Dr. Patricia Howard served as humanity's chief diplomat, and she had a gift for reading the subtle currents of galactic politics. She met privately with Counselor Dreth, who was one of the few elder members willing to acknowledge that problems existed. They sat in a quiet garden where plants from 100 worlds grew in careful harmony. Dreth admitted that the council was fracturing from within. Humanity's defiance had given courage to others who questioned whether an institution that preserved order at the cost of justice deserved to exist unchanged. Some members were calling for complete reformation of the entire system. Patricia listened carefully and then said that such reformation would be a good thing. An institution that valued stability above everything else would eventually become rigid and brittle. Change was necessary for survival, and the council had resisted change for too long. Dreth countered that humans spoke eloquently about justice, but they practiced occupation and forced cultural transformation. How was that different from imperialism? Patricia smiled and explained the difference clearly. Imperialism extracted resources and labor for the benefit of the conqueror. Reconstruction invested resources and time for the benefit of the defeated. In 20 years, Krathis would hold free elections, and in 30 years, human forces would withdraw completely. Could the Council say the same about any species under its protection? The question hung in the air, and Dreth had no answer because they both knew the truth. Protected species remained protected forever because the Council needed them to be dependent. Independence threatened the power structure that kept elder species in control. Humanity was offering something radical. They were offering temporary occupation followed by genuine freedom. It was messy and imperfect, but it was also honest. Patricia asked when the Council last gave any species the chance to stand on their own without guidance. Dreth looked away because acknowledging that truth meant admitting the entire system was flawed. Back on the UNS, Retribution Commander Jake Morrison received coded transmissions from Admiral Lisa Campbell, who was still maintaining position near Council space. She warned him that 3 Council species had just announced they were following the human model. They were demanding the right to maintain independent military forces without Council oversight. The Council was losing its monopoly on legitimate violence, and that monopoly had been the foundation of its power for thousands of years. Jake smiled grimly because he understood what was happening. Humanity had not just won a war. They had started a revolution that would reshape galactic politics for generations. Lieutenant Amy Chen looked worried when she read the same reports, and she asked Jake if he truly understood what this meant. By defying the Council, humanity had become responsible for whatever came next. If other species followed their example and failed, then humans would bear part of that blame. If the old order collapsed completely, then the resulting chaos might be worse than the flawed system it replaced. Jake acknowledged all of those concerns because he had thought about them constantly for months. But he also knew they could not walk away now. Humanity had told the galaxy they knew a better way, and now they had to prove. Down on Krathis, Rachel walked through a newly reopened school where young Zathran were learning a curriculum that emphasized cooperation instead of conquest. The teachers were a mix of humans and moderate Zathran, who believed the old ways had led their people to disaster. Rachel watched children who had been taught to hate humans now learning mathematics from human instructors. It was slow work, and there were setbacks every day. Some parents refused to send their children. Some students disrupted classes, but others were genuinely curious about these strange aliens who won the war and then stayed to help. Those were the ones who gave Rachel hope. Kresh met with Rachel again that evening, and his attitude had shifted slightly. He said he had been talking with other former officers and civilians about what the humans were really trying to accomplish. Most still did not trust humanity and probably never would, but some were beginning to understand that occupation with an exit strategy was fundamentally different from permanent conquest. Some were even cautiously optimistic that their children might live in a better world. Rachel listened and felt a weight lift from her shoulders because this was progress, slow and fragile but real. She told Kresh that was all humanity hoped for. A chance to prove that strength could serve something greater than domination. 5 years had passed since the ceasefire order that humanity ignored, and the galaxy looked fundamentally different from the ordered hierarchy that had existed for millennia. The old Galactic Council still met in their crystal chambers, but their authority had transformed from absolute to advisory. Nobody disbanded the institution because that would have created chaos, but nobody took their pronouncements as law anymore either. Species made their own decisions and formed their own alliances, and the Council mostly provided a neutral space where disputes could be discussed without immediately leading to war. It was messy and unpredictable, but it was also more honest than the system it replaced. The Krathis Republic held its 3rd democratic election, and for the first time in their history, the Zathran people chose their leaders through peaceful voting rather than military strength. Human advisors still walked through government buildings, but increasingly, they observed rather than directed. The Republic was learning to govern itself and making the inevitable mistakes that came with freedom. Some policies failed spectacularly, and others worked better than anyone expected. But the important thing was that the Zathran were making their own choices and learning from their own failures. That was what growth looked like, and it could not be rushed. Ambassador Kyle Harris represented humanity in the reformed Galactic Assembly, which had replaced the old council structure. The new chamber was designed differently, with representatives sitting in concentric circles rather than hierarchical tiers. Every species had equal voice, regardless of how long they had been members or how powerful their militaries were. It was a radical change that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago, but the old system had collapsed under its own contradictions. Kyle stood before the assembly and prepared to give what would be his final speech. Before rotating back to Earth after a decade of service, he began by acknowledging that 5 years ago this same body ordered humanity to stop fighting and humanity refused. The decision to defy that order was not made out of bloodlust or desire for conquest. It was made because humans understood something the Council had forgotten over thousands of years. Peace without justice was just a pause between atrocities. True peace required accountability and consequences for aggression, and a willingness to invest in rebuilding what was broken. The old Council wanted stability, but they confused stability with the absence of change. Real stability came from justice and systems that adapted to meet new challenges. High Arbiter Velnoth listened from a seat that no longer commanded automatic respect. The position had been reduced to one voice among many, and Velnoth had watched the entire power structure crumble while humanity built something new from the ruins. The Arbiter asked Kyle if he truly believed human methods were just. The occupation and forced restructuring and decades of oversight. Kyle thought carefully before responding because the question deserved honesty. He said that human methods were not perfect and mistakes were made along the way. But when human forces withdrew from Krathis next year, they would leave behind a functioning democracy rather than a smoking ruin. That mattered even if the process was uncomfortable. Former Admiral Kresh rose to speak and the chamber fell silent because his presence carried enormous symbolic weight. He represented the Krathis Republic now, and his journey from enemy commander to allied diplomat fascinated every species that paid attention. Kresh said bluntly that the human occupation had not been easy. They demanded changes that challenged everything the Zathran believed about strength and honor. They tolerated no corruption and no return to old ways. But they also taught his people something vital. True strength was not domination over others. True strength was knowing when to show restraint and choosing cooperation over conquest. The Zathran were learning that lesson slowly, but the next generation would understand it in their bones. On Krathis Prime, Colonel Rachel Bennett prepared to hand over final authority to the Republic's own defense forces. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Zathran soldiers in new uniforms stood at attention, while Rachel officially transferred command to General Vex, who had been a junior officer during the war. Captain Danny Wright stood beside Rachel and seemed melancholy. 5 years of building something important and now they were leaving. It felt strange to walk away after investing so much. Rachel understood his feelings because she felt the same way. But she also knew that walking away was the entire point of everything they had done. She told Danny that if the Zathran still needed human oversight in 10 years, then humanity had failed. The goal was always to make themselves obsolete. They came to teach and protect and guide until the Republic could stand alone. That time had arrived faster than anyone expected, and it was cause for celebration, not sadness. Danny nodded but said he would miss the work and the people. Rachel smiled and said she would miss it too. But their job was done and other species needed help learning the same lessons. The galaxy was full of conflicts waiting for people who understood that winning was not enough. Admiral Jake Morrison commanded the entire human fleet now, and his responsibilities had grown enormously since that day, 5 years ago when he defied the Council order. He received reports from across human space, and the news was mostly good. New technologies continued emerging from laboratories that had learned to think creatively during the war. The economy was strong because dozens of species wanted to trade with humans who had proven themselves reliable partners. But the most important change was cultural. Human military doctrine now emphasized rebuilding as much as fighting. Every officer learned that winning battles meant nothing if you did not win the peace that followed. Commander Amy Chen brought troubling news that interrupted his review of fleet readiness reports. Distress calls were coming from the outer rim where the Vortan Collective was invading neutral systems. Early reports suggested millions of casualties and systematic destruction of anything that resisted. It was the Zathran invasion all over again, except this time it was happening to species that humans barely knew. Jake asked what the reformed assembly was doing. Amy said 3 member species had already dispatched fleets without asking permission. They were following the example humanity set 5 years ago. If aggression went unpunished, then the entire system humanity helped build would collapse. Jake felt satisfaction that other species had learned the lesson but also concerned because coordinating multiple fleets from different cultures was complicated. He asked about Admiral Lisa Campbell, who commanded the Second Fleet. Amy said Lisa was requesting permission to take her forces to assist, and that she wanted to send a message to the Vortons. The galaxy had new rules now, and conquest had consequences. If they did not stand down immediately, they would learn that humanity was not the only species willing to fight for justice. Jake granted permission without hesitation and told Amy to coordinate with the other responding fleets. This was what the new order looked like in practice. Back at the Reformed Assembly, Kyle delivered the conclusion of his final speech. He said that 5 years ago the Council told humanity to stop, and humans responded that they were just getting started. Today he could finally say they were approaching the finish line, not because threats had disappeared, but because the galaxy finally had the will to face them collectively. That was the real difference humanity made. The old Council maintained order through authority and the threat of sanctions. The new Assembly maintained peace through cooperation and mutual defense. Which system was sustainable, and which was truly just remained to be seen? History would be the final judge. But Kyle knew which system humanity would defend with everything they had. After the session ended, Kresh approached Kyle privately and spoke with the directness that characterized their relationship. He said humans were the strangest species in the galaxy. They fought with terrifying intensity and then rebuilt what they destroyed. They rejected authority and then took responsibility for outcomes. They preached justice and then did whatever was necessary to achieve it. Kresh admitted he could not decide if humanity was the galaxy's salvation or its greatest threat. Kyle smiled at the honest assessment and replied that humans could not decide either. That contradiction was what made them human. They were flawed and stubborn and occasionally hypocritical, but when someone told them to stop fighting for what was right, that was exactly when they were just getting started. 20 years later, historians would look back at this period as the inflection point when galactic civilization transformed from rigid hierarchy into dynamic cooperation. The Krathis Republic sent its first independent deep space exploration mission and made peaceful contact with 2 previously unknown species. The reformed Galactic Assembly grew to include 200 member species, each maintaining sovereign military forces under mutual defense pacts. Wars still happened because conflict was part of any living system, but they ended quickly when met with overwhelming coordinated response. Aggression became too costly and cooperation became the path of least resistance. It was not perfect, but it was better than what came before. And humanity continued doing what they did best. They fought when necessary and built when possible, and never backed down when someone tried to tell them that justice was too complicated to pursue. They remained contrarian,